And so, good morning, everybody. I feel this new normal. This is the way of introducing a seminar series. I'm sure I'm probably not alone in suggesting it feels a bit like Joe Wicks at 9 o'clock in the morning, welcoming the million people that have signed up to an exercise session. So let's exercise our minds instead. I understand there are 250 participants or so today, so we have to imagine ourselves in a very, very large room after a polite cup of coffee and a pastry to get us going. I think that does mean, though, that we have an awful lot of perspectives here, and it's great to be able to recognise that this subject has got so much interest. How do we therefore manage all of those perspectives, and how do we make sure that we have a useful and meaningful discussion today? From my point of view, I think it's great that this seminar is going to go where a lot of certainly the public chatter isn't really going. It's brilliant to see an awful lot of stuff about walking and cycling in the press, but this is primarily directed or focused on urban areas. And so I think today the combination of thinking about recovery after the virus, coupled with a green recovery are fantastic subject areas to try to get our heads around. We're very grateful today for Zeelo for sponsoring this event and making it happen, and of course to Landor for putting their machine to getting everybody together. What I'd like us to do, though, is try to hold on to what we're trying to get out of this and try and work that out through the seminar, in that it's great to listen to presentations, it's great to look at and listen to other people's questions, but I think it's more important that we all try to work out what we're trying to do with this so that hopefully we can start together to build some sort of agenda and more useful dialogue so that we can start working out what the future is for rural and suburban areas. So we're going to start with, well, I'm going to give a slide, and then we've got 3 presentations which I shall introduce briefly. They'll be for about anywhere between 5 and 10 minutes each. I'm going to take a couple of quick questions after each of those, but purely for clarification really on the presentations themselves. And then we're going to move into a question and answer session. Now, we all know, I suspect, that question and answer sessions normally relate to the last presentation that's been that people have listened to. And so I think it's important this time to try to keep perspective across the 3 presentations and see those as a way of framing the discussion that comes later. In terms of etiquette, we're all probably getting more and more used to this, but we're using, many different ways of communicating. You will see that there is a questions box on your screen somewhere. I'm not going to pretend to give you a lesson in how to use it, but the way that we would like you to plank questions is via that question box as well. We will somehow start logging the key questions, seeing what sorts of subjects are coming over, and then try and put those back to people as well. So I am chairing this, but in the background, fortunately, we have a couple from Landor helping us out, Mark and Juliana. So they will be helping move on our slides, and we'll also catch the life belt if we don't quite know what's happening with the technology. So Mark, could we move on to the next slide? Hooray, it works. How about that? So just to kick things off then a little bit, and to try and help frame what we're trying to do in this session. These are just some ideas that in conversation with people and just trying to check trends or check what's happening out there, I've just put a few ideas together. So if we look, I don't know, left and right. If we look top left here, pre-COVID trends. Before all of this happened, stuff was happening. There was an increasing realization of behavior change generally in society relating to transport. And there was the emergence of new ways of traveling, of the use of technology, of new ways of thinking about travel. In parallel with that, and also ongoing, if we move to the lower left, I will learn left and right. There is a whole load of things coming out of Department for Transport. The future of urban the future of mobility for urban areas and the promise of an equivalent, well, not an equivalent, but hopefully something bespoke about rural areas and understanding what that means. Many of you, I suspect, have got final drafts with huge amounts of track changes over your expressions of interest for the Rural Mobility Fund, which is bubbling at the moment. The decarbonisation plan, I would suggest, is one of the most important things that's come out of the Department for Transport for some time. So how does that relate to rural areas? And then it looks arcane, but the regulatory review possibly also has the potential to seriously change and unlock some of the restrictions as to why rural transport is just not working for most people at the moment. And then if we go top right, there's this rather inconvenient little thing happened called a global pandemic. But through that pandemic, with no disrespect clearly to the horrors of it, all sorts of people have had all sorts of experiences in rural areas of traveling differently. Now, some of these have been very negative, let's not pretend, but there's an awful lot of positive has come out of there. And so many people have been, for instance, walking and cycling a lot more, working from home a lot more. The whole home delivery sector has transformed and upped its game, especially in rural areas over the last couple of months. And so there is a whole area of opportunity of working out how we capture and bottle what most people have been experiencing and folding that back into pre-existing trends, all of these Department for Transport initiatives that are going on, so that if we look down to the bottom right, we can start to create whatever a new normal might look like for rural areas, rather than the current emphasis, not so much emphasis, but the current chatter that seems to be all around urban areas. Do we need different sets of priorities? Do we need different rules, different ways of appraising things, different ways of setting up services, different models of governance, different economic models perhaps? These are all things and all questions that are up in the air at the moment. Now, I'm not suggesting that is the whole agenda. All I'm doing is trying to identify some of these key ideas that might help us to frame today's discussion. And so moving to today's discussion, I think, although I may have got this wrong, oh heck, this might be my first glitch. No, we're going to have 3 presentations today. The first will be by Sam Ryan, who is CEO of Zeelo. I'm not going to pretend to introduce him or Zeelo because he's better at doing it than I do. We're then going to move on to Graham Stanley, who's going to talk about what's happening in Oxfordshire through Oxfordshire County Council and Mobox on the developments that they're working on there. And then we're going to move to Nick Bromley, who's going to talk about, again, in a different context, about some work that they're doing in Derbyshire, and the findings, well, the problems and the findings that are coming out of that. So I will now shut up. I don't have to do all of those things about there not being any fire alarms. So if you have a fire alarm, just leg it, because you're on your own on this one. But we this time don't have to do anything about it. So there we are. There is always the risk that I've been on mute and you haven't heard anything for the last 5 minutes, which I apologise. But assuming that's not the case, I'd like to hand over to Sam. Thank you.
Thanks, Alistair. Don't worry, we heard you. So if we go on to that next slide, please. So I'm going to tell you a bit today about our smart bus sharing service, which is focused on commuting and school runs, and it's designed specifically for this rural and suburban use case. And I want to talk a bit about how we think that plays into the green restart and recovery. So moving on to the next slide, something that we're all too aware of is that unfortunately the car is still king, and I think that as we move into this next phase of this crisis, there's a significant risk that actually we see an increase in private car usage as we come out of this. And this problem is particularly prevalent in rural and suburban areas. And Moving on to the next slide, I think what we found from a lot of our user research is that it's often the case that although sometimes people do like driving, actually often it's the only viable option. And that's because particularly in rural and suburban areas, what we call public transport deserts exist everywhere. The car is increasingly being viewed as an expensive, polluting nightmare. And it's certainly a barrier to accessing work and education. And that point's quite important because actually I think when we think about who is responsible for providing this kind of transportation and who funds this kind of transportation, when we think about the impact that actually a lack of public transport has on companies' abilities to recruit and retain staff, the need for car parking, the need for congestion, and the impact that has on local authorities, on companies, etc., means that this affects a much wider group of stakeholders. So just moving on to the next slide, just I'll briefly introduce our solution. We're a bus sharing company. We provide smart transportation for commuting and school runs. The sort of three fundamental areas of that is that we use data and technology to understand where fixed bus routes should exist but don't currently. We design and operate them. We target areas of high private car usage, and we focus very much on connecting people to work and education via sustainable transport. We do that by partnering with existing local bus and coach fleets, which means that we only have to operate these services at the times that they are needed, giving that flexibility in the supply model. The net impact on average is 30 cars into one bus. So these are high occupancy vehicles. I'm just moving on to the next slide. This very much positions us in the market. I'm sure lots of you have heard a lot about demand responsive transport, which mainly operates in that sort of more in that urban use case in the top left-hand corner. We're very much focused on this mass transit use case for what we call the peri-urban segment, but these are everyday journeys. People in rural and suburban areas are driving 10 to 20 kilometers on a daily basis to get to work, to get to school. And moving on to the next slide, I just wanted to just hammer home that sort of distinction between what we are providing as an express bus service versus a kind of demand responsive bus service, such as services like Arriva Click, and we very much think they're complementary, but they serve slightly different use cases and different needs. We position ourselves very much as a convenient and commercially viable alternative to the car. We design our services for specific use cases, but it's not an e-hailing service. We provide fixed routes that only need to operate at certain times of day, which allows us to actually match the peaks in demand, i.e. moving people from rural or suburban areas to industrial parks or to smaller towns and cities, where actually there is only the demand at certain times of day to need these services. And our flexible supply model allows us to deliver that in a commercially viable way. So just moving on to the next slide, please, thank you. Our service is a fully managed transport service. So we do everything from the route generation. We ingest different data sources to actually work out where public transport deserts exist. We design these fixed bus routes that convince people to leave their car at home and to use a zeelo service instead. We work with local coach operators which have spare capacity in their fleets to increase their fleet utilization, so it's a better use of existing assets, and that gives us the flexibility to launch services quickly and optimize them over time. All of that is powered by technology, and we combine that with real humans with expertise in data, operations, and marketing to support that. And on the next slide, just briefly a bit more about the technology. There's sort of three key strands to it. The first is the routing engine, which, as I just said, is very much designed around how do we design routes that are attractive for people that are in rural and suburban areas for commuting to industrial sites, small towns, etc. We use public transport information and mobility data to design those routes to make sure they're convenient and fundamentally commercially viable. We sell tickets and subscriptions via our mobile apps and allow our passengers to track the services. And we operate all of that using a set of operational tools which allow us to automate the experience and deliver a great experience for our passengers. Moving on to the next slide, this wouldn't be a COVID webinar without a mention of COVID. We've obviously had to adapt our business model. We've adapted our booking technology to ensure that all services are pre-booked so we can manage safe capacities and onboard social distancing, which also allows us to provide contact tracing in the event that a passenger presents with symptoms. And we've, of course, increased all of our operational standards with our partner operators to increase the level of sanitization, increase the use of PPE, and so on. And we're currently delivering these dedicated services for critical workers to take the pressure off public transport at this current time, but to keep to continue to take people to work on a daily basis. So just an example on the next slide. We primarily deliver these services in partnership with companies, and companies provide funding for these services to get them up and running. But we can also deliver these services in partnership with local authorities and deliver them on a more public basis. But the key thing here is that it doesn't need to be one or the other. There is ability here to combine both private and public funding. And here is an example of an employer in Avara Foods, 2 sites across different parts of the Midlands. There's very limited public transport to these locations. Their workers don't have access to the cars. Quite frankly, they wouldn't be able to employ the volume of people that they employ unless they provided these services. We provide these services to match their shift patterns. We give them the flexibility when their shift patterns change. And across 7 routes, we transport over 300 daily riders. Over 60% of those staff don't actually have access to a car, so this really is a lifeline for their employment. And we get very strong ratings for the service. That's just one example of many across the UK and other territories. Just moving on to the next slide, just sort of 3 more slides here before I finish off. I just wanted to summarize the impact that we believe these services have on everyday life. So, you know, for the actual passengers or the riders themselves, it's access to affordable transportation that allows them to reach employment and education. For businesses and education, it gives them access to staff. There's a reduced need for car parking. It helps them to hit their sustainability goals. And fundamentally, they are also willing to subsidize these services. And that's important from the perspective of getting these services to the point that they are commercially viable, which is fundamental challenge we all face in mass transit. For regions, local authorities or municipalities, you know, we are moving people directly out of cars and into bus transportation, and therefore having a significant impact with respect to the climate crisis, congestion and air quality. We help to boost local employment, and that is furthered in the fact that we work with existing locally run coach operators to improve the vehicle utilization of their existing fleets and give them access to new opportunities that previously they wouldn't be able to get access to. So moving on to the next slide, I just wanted to talk about the Rural Mobility Fund, and we're in conversations with a number of local authorities about trialing this as an alternative model for the Rural Mobility Fund, given that most local authorities will be going with the sort of more established, let's say, and more well-known demand responsive transport model that many of you are more familiar with. But we believe that actually some of this rural mobility funding should be used to trial alternative flexible bus services like ours that truly target public transport deserts and give a complementary service to public transport. And that ticks a number of the boxes here that are pulled out in the Rural Mobility Fund brief around connecting people to employment with a focus on industrial areas, getting services to commercial viability through a hybrid funding model, using a data-driven approach to design those services and truly understand the demand, a better use of existing assets by partnering with local coach operators, and fundamentally high occupancy vehicles for maximum impact. So just moving on to the next slide, this is how I wanted to wrap up. This is my favorite illustration of what we aim to do as a business. And we'd love to talk to local authorities about how we can make this happen. We have the technology and expertise to deploy these on a B2B or a B2C basis. And the impact is 30 cars into one bus, which I hope you'll all agree. If we can achieve that in rural and suburban areas, then we can have a huge impact. So thank you. I'll hand back over to Alistair now. There are my details there if needed.
Hi, I think I'm unmuted, but I don't think I can see myself. Hang on. Professional at all times. There we are. Right. Thank you very much, Sam, for that. I think by the rate at which questions are coming in, that's certainly provided an awful lot of thought. from my point of view, when I heard that you were kind of, in the game for all of this and that, I thought, blimey, the one thing that people almost daren't talk about is public transport post-COVID in rural areas. You think, blimey. So that's worth listening to. So we've had a load of questions. I'm going to bring a few of them up now because I think they're very specific to what you've been talking about, and I think I don't want to lose them. And I'll try to keep them fairly specific. We had a couple of questions about, do you operate just in England, or are you Scotland and Wales as well?
Yeah, we operate all over the UK.
Yeah, fine, okay. There's a few that I'll cluster together, which I think is more clarification of your operational and your economic model. And so, for instance, one question, and forgive me to those who, oh, here we are, Alex Pringle was asking, how might your economic model work with the idea of staggered commute times? And so, almost the necessity to reduce occupancy in order to stretch out commute times as well. And there's another question somewhere, Paul Mason, about occupancy and how does the economic model stack up for reduced occupancy?
Sure. So I guess the key part of both of those questions is to, I guess, explain our background, which is actually we as a business have been very geared up to partner with companies and with schools and so on who actually provide subsidies to get these services up and running. But we also operate a hybrid model where essentially we can combine some of that private subsidy. So if you're a company and you have 15 staff and you'd like to subsidize that specific service, we give them the platform to do that, but we can also sell that spare capacity B2C. The key about the staggered shift times. So historically, sort of pre-COVID, we've had two models anyway. We serve lots of office-based businesses where people needed flexibility, and generally there you use vehicles operating back to back in the peak times, which allows you to have, say, 3, 4, 5 arrival times in the morning peak, and 4, 5, 6 arrivals in the afternoon peak. And then we combine we use those same vehicles and drivers to serve industrial locations, which are perhaps operating 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. shifts. So actually we already have that sort of challenge of staggered shifts, and we've been able to utilize the vehicles more effectively by kind of creating that regional density, which actually allows us to deliver these services on a more flexible basis. And sorry, the second question was around the economics of reduced occupancy. I think it's probably the question on everybody's minds, every public transport operator's mind right now. I think the fundamentals are that passengers are not willing to pay what it will cost to operate these services if we are really going to have to enforce 2-meter social distancing for some time, and therefore we are leveraging private sector subsidies because actually these companies are desperate to either continue to operate safely or to reopen their businesses safely, and therefore actually providing private transportation or dedicated services for their staff is key. I think obviously the public sector will need to rely on public sector subsidies for that. I think fundamentally research is starting to come out now that social distancing on public transportation is not necessarily the answer, because if you're sharing the same air conditioning unit, you're in a tin box, you're in as much risk at the front of the vehicle as you are at the back of the vehicle, and therefore actually the things that we need to focus on is better air filtration and use of PPE, and I think that is actually and better sanitization between each service, and I think that is how we will control infection risk, and that is how we will build confidence in mass transit again, which is our big challenge. Okay,
and I'm just going to clump together a couple of other questions, and then I think we're going to have to move on.
Sure.
And I will. I'm going to link together Martin Higgitt's question and Nigel Hinch's question. So Martin Higgitt's asking, so in rural areas where there are a few buses already, kind of what's the magic bullet that this is bringing? I guess that it's almost like you're developing public transport in rural areas that have been the holy grail for some time. I'm interpreting what Martin might be saying here, so forgive me if I've got that wrong. And secondly, Nigel Hinch's question is, an awful lot of the kind of bus-shaped objects that move around rural areas are community transport buses, and they tend to be the smaller type 17-seaters or something like that, which I'm interpreting suggests that that's the scale of demand. And if we then spread that scale out through social distancing, how does that work in terms of your model and how you see it?
Sure. So to focus on the first question, we think one of the big challenges with public transport is that because it tries to be inclusive from the perspective of every single route that is designed must serve everybody's needs, right? It wants to take people to work, it wants to take people shopping, it wants to take kids to school. Therefore, it never actually serves anybody particularly well, right? And actually, if you design services for specific use cases, i.e., you have peak time services that take people to industrial areas to work or to the city centre to work, and you have off-peak services that take people direct to shopping, you therefore create a better experience for those specific use cases, right? So to in layman's terms, if I have the option of driving my car 25 minutes direct from my house to an industrial location, and that costs me, say, £4 a day in fuel, or I have the opportunity to take a local bus which stops 60 times where I need to get to and takes nearly an hour, I think I know which one I would choose if I had the opportunity. And therefore, actually, I think we need to relook at the inclusivity question, because I think actually we can make public transport more inclusive by it serving specific groups at specific times.
Okay, thank you. I think what this presentation is demonstrating is we could probably spend a whole day on this, and I think that's fantastic because I think it is touching on all sorts of questions about, well, buses in all of their guises in rural areas. The idea of new models, both operational and economic models, being applied in rural areas, which is, absolute music to a lot of people's ears, I suppose. And there've been some questions we've not managed to get through, so I apologise to those that have asked them, but maybe we'll come back to them later, about all sorts of issues to do with, competition rules and, implicitly regulation and all the rest of it. So there's loads of things we could talk about here, and it's with some reluctance then that I feel I need to close down and move on. But maybe we'll pick up some of these things later on if that's okay.
Great, thanks, okay. Alistair. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Sam. Can I just remind participants that if you do have questions that you really do want an answer, then you are able to clearly contact the presenters after all the questions will go to the presenters after the presentation, so they should have the opportunity to get back to you, or you should have the opportunity to get more detailed answers from the presenters. Okay, so moving on, I'm now surrounded with huge amounts of pieces of paper, so this has lots of potential for me to lose it. But there we are. We're going to move on now to Graham Stanley. Graham Stanley is going to speak from the perspective of Oxfordshire County Council and about what they're doing through Mobox as well as other things. I have now lost my screen. Just a moment. There we are. So I'm now going to hand over to Graham to introduce himself and to talk about his project. Graham.
Thank you, Alistair. Hello, everyone. I'm the Community Engagement and Projects Officer at the Innovation Hub at Oxfordshire County Council. Apologies for not having a video. I'm working from a data link and want to make sure I have a good connection for audio. I'll be discussing how we at the Innovation Hub used a community-driven approach to identify the mobility challenges faced by suburban and rural areas, and then co-created solutions to these challenges. Next slide, please. Oxfordshire County Council is a partner in Cities for People, which is an EU H2020 funded project running in Oxford and 4 other cities in Europe. The project seeks to trial co-creation methodology, bringing together citizens, local authorities, mobility providers, and innovation experts to develop neighborhood-level mobility solutions by developing and providing a framework of support services and tools. C4P empowers these communities to actively contribute to shaping their local mobility innovation ecosystems in line with a people-oriented transport and mobility approach. Change the slide, please. While other partner cities in the C4P project focused on urban centers, in Oxford, we chose to focus on the neighborhood of Barton, which is a bedroom community on the very outskirts of the city. You can see it on the right-hand side of the map there, that the indices of multiple deprivation identify as one of the most deprived in Oxford. To initiate the co-creation process, we held community events with local citizens, discussing and prioritizing the mobility challenges they and their neighbors face in getting around Oxford. The response we got back was quite clear. The spoke and wheel bus system in Oxford was not well suited for the mobility needs of people in Barton. As you can see from the map, Barton's actually quite well connected to the city center with bus routes. However, people in Barton were more interested in accessing affordable shopping, which is labeled with red shopping carts, workplaces and hospitals, which are circled in green, all of which were overwhelmingly also on the outskirts of the city. To get to these places from Barton using public transport, you would need to take a bus into the city center and transfer onto one or even two other buses to travel back out again. During peak travel times, this type of journey can be costly and take up to 2 or even 3 hours each way, all the travel to a destination only 2 or 3 miles away. Once the community had established this problem with the transport network, we went back to the citizens in the community to come up with their own solutions, and they did. We collected over 70 ideas, which were filtered and developed at a hack day hosted in Barton. These were then selected by vote and tested in a real-world pilot. We ran a series of weekly minibus trips to local supermarkets using assets already in the community, a minibus owned by the community association and drivers from the local area. These proved to be very popular. They save both time and money for users at very low operating costs. Can we change the slide, please? Following this first intervention, we sought to scale up this solution into several rural villages just beyond Barton, an area that has no scheduled public transport service. We found in these villages, communities were eager not only to access affordable supermarkets, but also just to gain access to Oxford's public transport network. So we designed, together with villagers, a simple minibus service bookable through SMS message, which ended up looking a lot like a many-to-one DRT service, providing access to both ASDA and a transport hub where people could easily transfer into central Oxford. We again used assets from within the community, the same minibus from the Barton Community Association, and part-time and volunteer drivers from within the community. This service, which we ran from January through the end of March this year, proved enormously popular, so much so that we had to redesign routes to manage the demand. The flexible nature of the service allowed for straightforward adjustments to adhere to social distancing requirements at the onset of the COVID emergency. I think this is a benefit of DRT that I think Sam pointed out really well in the previous presentation, actually. Between the demand for this service and fees that passengers were willing to pay, we found that we could establish a volunteer-led, self-sustaining minibus service in an area that had previously been unable to sustain a regular scheduled service. And I'm not going to lie to you here. There are challenges, certainly challenges, to co-creating mobility solutions with the community. I think the first among these is the time investment required. However, I think we feel that benefits of putting citizens at the core are clear and overwhelming. In a nutshell, by working together with the community to identify challenges and develop solutions, we were able to access the knowledge, resources, and energy held by the community. What this meant practically was we were able to develop a demand-driven mobility solution based on the expressed needs of people in the community. We were able to access the assets held by the community, such as a minibus owned by the local community association. And finally, the community developed a sense of ownership, becoming invested in the success of their mobility intervention. And this in itself brought with it a number of benefits, such as enabling us to use volunteer drivers and relying on people in the community to promote the service, particularly through word of mouth. Through the C4P project, we've been able to contrast the use of co-creation methods in urban centers, such as in the other 4 cities in the project, versus the suburban and rural areas we've been focusing on in Oxfordshire. And what we found is that the community cohesion, as well as the type and significance of the mobility challenges faced by rural and suburban communities, lends itself quite well to a community-focused co-creation approach. While the mobility of interventions developed in urban centers relied on government and business for implementation, in our rural areas in particular, the community became our primary implementation partner in the suburban and rural settings we focused on. This level of community involvement was made possible by the buy-in earned through the co-creation approach we took. And in turn, the mobility solutions we developed could only be self-sustaining through continued and robust contributions from the community. That's it from me. Thank you. I'll pass back to Alistair if there's any questions. Hello? In this last slide here, I'm just waiting for Alistair to join again. In this last slide here, we have the minibus we used with one of the enthusiastic volunteer drivers we had. Go ahead, Alistair.
I think I'm back again. Sorry, I lost my mute button. So there we are. Great, thank you very much for that indeed. And so we see once again a different type of way of getting buses into rural areas in ways that clearly fit what were, pre-existing demand. But if I interpret correctly, you have found a way of supplying that demand in a way that clearly gets lapped up by people. I'm aware of time, so can I just bring out 2 questions? And clearly there's an awful lot coming in here now. I'd like to go first to Graham Bannister's question. You're talking about assets already existing in the community. What about people's cars? I'd like to broaden that question maybe, because I think there's a point that's coming out from here and the previous presentation by Sam about using existing assets better and therefore getting better efficiency out of existing assets. And clearly the ultimate of that is spreading out into people carriers or cars or social car schemes or taxis, all that kind of stuff. Do you have any comment at the moment, Graham, on to what is the scope of the types of assets that you might use in a scheme such as this?
I think my understanding of the Rural Mobility Fund is anything over 2 occupants is eligible. In Oxford County, we also operate a Good Neighbor scheme that uses personal vehicles in the community. And we found this marries quite well with community transport, where a larger bus can take people to destinations where their arrival time is flexible, like shopping, whereas doctor's appointments and other inflexible appointments are better suited for a Good Neighbor scheme using personal vehicles. I should also emphasize, due to the short pilots that we ran in this project, we focused on a manual booking system. But what we're looking at in the RMF is how we can better leverage technology to more efficiently use the existing assets and volunteers in the community.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'm aware there are questions coming through here, but I'm also aware of time. So I am going to now ask if we can move on. I'll pick up some of these key questions that are coming through if we have time at the end. But I'd now like to move on to Nick Bromley. And I kind of introduced him earlier, so he's probably better than I am at introducing his what he's talking about through his presentation. Nick.
Thanks, Alistair. Good morning, everyone. Well, perhaps I can go on to my next slide and pose everybody a question. The question is, where is this? And I'm quite happy to treat somebody to a local beer, water, or a spirit of their choice. So my background is actually 30 years working in the technology industry and transport technology in particular, but on big projects, so bits of Crossrail, London interchanges, etc. So my interest actually is now that I live actually in a very rural area, as you can see, and I think it's probably more complex in many ways than trying to deal with the urban transport problem. So I'll take you through a survey that was done local to where I live. I think it's a very interesting piece of work. So if we can put up the next slide, please. So basically, it's unusual to find a good survey, I might say, particularly in rural areas. And this particular town has 22,000 people. Now, that in itself puts it in the category of 950 towns, which range between 20k and 100k population, which is roughly 25% of the UK population sits in this category. So this is significant. So this isn't, you know, your Birminghams and your Londons, etc. This means that there's a whole clutch of towns out there that need serving properly with a rural mobility solution. So a survey was done. 900 plus residents responded, which is about 4% of the population. A large number of those were online. Again, interesting indicator of the use of technology. But the other thing was the town, the topography is quite critical in rural areas, I think, and we'll go into that. But basically, the town is about a mile radius. But the other thing about it is it's isolated, like a lot of these towns. It's about 30 plus miles to a major city. So 57% were over 50, again, significant. That's the people who responded. But also a larger proportion of females responded to the survey as well. Typically mixed economy, quarrying, agriculture, tourism, but all the modes are in play here. So next slide, please. So I'm now going to take you through some of the key results. So I found this very interesting. So how do you travel to work, college or university? In other words, how do you get about in the wider area? So of course, we've got a number on foot, but they're not going to walk 30 miles into the nearest major habitation. If you look at the other big one that stands out, of course, it's the car or car sharing. But interestingly, how low the level of both buses, 4.7%, and bicycle, 4.2%. So there's some interesting interplay going on here. So if we go and look at the town itself, how people move around within the town, that's the next slide. So we see a very similar pattern actually, but obviously the amount of car use is going down within the town. It's a mile radius, so people can walk. But of course, people are walking, therefore walking's gone up. But interestingly, the bicycle is more or less the same, as is the bus usage. So interesting. So we're basically either walking in rural areas or in our cars. So next slide. So the next question which people were answering was, do you own a car? Well, look at this. I mean, you know, almost 90% of the respondees owned a car. And then the other interesting one was actually how many actually owned a bicycle, so that was almost a half of the people owned a bicycle. So the surprise is, so we've got a lot of car use because we have cars and they're satisfying a particular need. But the interesting one is this bicycle thing, because actually we're getting only 4% use, yet almost half the households seem to have bikes. So next slide. So the question then was, if we're going to build a sustainable mobility solution in a rural area, then obviously let's have a think about using the bike more. So what do we need to do? So the sorts of things that people wanted were improved road surfaces, better cycle routes, cycle lanes to protect them, etc. Better provision at work, but generally it's this safety issue. But I think the one that was missed off this was in fact the reference to terrain and weather, neither which you can actually control. So this actually has a big impact on cycling. Now, I'm a keen cyclist myself. I do quite a lot each week, probably 100, 200 miles. But I'm a recreational cyclist rather than using it for commuting. But clearly what would put me off going out is always going to be either a difficult route or particularly the weather. So next slide. So one of the things that they were asked in the town was, if electric bikes are available, would you be inclined to use it? Now, you'd have thought everybody at this point would jump in and say, fantastic, let's use an electric bike. That will get me around, save me walking, make my life a lot easier. But the interesting thing is actually, is that 56% would say actually will not use it at all. And then if you put in the possibilities, which are probably they definitely won't use it, you've actually got a very small number of people would be using bikes. So if we start thinking in the round now about sustainability, the other thing that we were asked about, next slide, was the use of an electric vehicle. So in other words, here we are, rural area, you think we'd all be sustainable. As a rural mobility solution, let's have electric cars. And again, you see actually the numbers of people who are likely to use these, the not at all is 40%, the possible is just over 40%. So actually, sustainable solutions aren't necessarily going to work. There isn't much interest there in the population in going down that route, which sort of returns us to the last two discussions we've had and presentations, which is about this whole area of demand responsive transport, shared use, we'll call them buses. So if we go on to my next slide. So I think the learning points from this study is, first of all, interestingly, a lot of people will shop locally for their food shopping, but otherwise people want to get out of the area. They want to go into the main, areas of choice. They want variety, so they'll go into the main towns or cities surrounding this area. People are happy to walk, but interestingly, people aren't so happy to get on buses. Despite high bike ownership, cycling active travel is generally poor usage. We have this incredible problem, I think, which is, I call it the locked-in car use. And this is why I think people like it in rural areas. It gives them freedom, it's convenient, it's flexible, but the key thing is it's functional. And if you look at how people actually use their vehicles out here, I mean, they can be anything from having 2 lambs on the back seat to a load of kiddie clutter, or in my case, it's a travelling bike shed. So I think the locked-in car use is a very difficult thing to dislodge. And clearly sustainability is not a priority out here, which did surprise me. So, but I think the key to unlocking this, the key to moving this whole rural mobility debate forward and making a difference is clearly shared use, but it's actually understanding the demand, the D in DRT. Now, this is actually a very complex problem. So I come from an evidential background, so both big data, but devising the use of mobile phone tracking for vehicle movement. And it strikes me the biggest problem we have is actually be able to properly count the trips, but also knowing what the trip purpose is. In other words, what the use case is. So some of the work I've been doing is actually looking particularly at health. And you see some interesting dichotomies again in that data, because on one hand, you have an aging population in rural areas. They need increasing help as they go over the age of 70. But then when you look at the numbers actually going to surgery, it's still relatively small. So the interesting thing is, how do you actually get shared use into that environment, particularly with COVID, because these people are highly vulnerable. And so clearly you need to look at not just the costs of getting them in, i.e. the daily cost of laying on a bus, but you actually have to look at the reverse of this, and that is how you can actually get the doctors out to these people if you don't provide that service. So I think one of the things that has interested me about this piece of work is how we need to think very carefully in the round about the business case. It's not just enough to think about the cost of the actual transport or mobility. You have to look at the business case on the other side, the cost of the community of not actually having to transport in the wider sense. So I think to really conclude, what I would say is I think rural area transport needs are just as complex as urban or city-based areas. In many ways, I would say it's much more complex, because you can literally put anything on in the city and by and large people will easily get access to it because it's within a few hundred meters of probably thousands of people. In rural areas, you've got a few thousand people and it might be spread over tens of miles. But I think the key also is getting urban and rural areas to work together, because actually the urban problem starts in many cases as people get on buses, get in their, well, primarily get in their cars, and then go into the city areas, causing congestion in the urban areas. So I think this is where the buses come in, some shared use transport to try as we saw earlier on, reduce the numbers of vehicles down from 30, let's say, to a single coach. So that's what I wanted to say. So be delighted to take a few questions on this and share more learning.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that, Nick. Again, like the other presentations, it's certainly generated some questions. I'll just take a couple of fairly specific, I'll just plant a couple of fairly specific ones first, if that's all right. A few people at the beginning, could you just clarify the area that you're working on here, which specific locations you were referring to?
Right, well, all I will say, it's in Derbyshire, and it's in a picturesque part of Derbyshire. So no, I won't give them the answer to where those original slides were.
Oh, okay, all right, fair enough. There were some questions, and I'll put them together, Sarah, Colin Little, all the rest of it, on the surveys that we're using themselves. I think I get the impression, and this is only my impression, that people were looking at your results and didn't quite recognize them relative to perhaps what they knew. Now, that's not me questioning the validity of those results, but could you, because everywhere is different in different ways, but could you maybe say a little bit more about the sorts of people that you were interviewing, in what sort of context or questioning, and just a little bit more about the survey technique that you used?
Okay, well, I wasn't directly involved in this questionnaire, but this was put together. It was about 30 questions. It went out to complete cross-section, so anything from school age right the way through to 80, 85 plus years old. And as I said, the 57% of the respondees were over the age of 50. To a certain extent, that tracks local demographics because it's an aging population, but actually it is still skewed. So it's the older people, primarily women. So women responded 60% of cases, and the preferred way of responding was online. Now, I've been involved with all sorts of surveys over the years, you know, roadside interviews, various other techniques for extracting data. And I thought this was quite a good piece of work because it allowed people choices and it encouraged them to give more insight to why they were making certain types of trips. So what was the trip purpose in effect? So that was the interesting thing about it. But I wasn't at all surprised once we'd thought about it. Actually, a mile, well, of course, that's a nice distance to walk, 15 minutes. And this actually comes back to the work I did at TfL, where actually we were looking at walking patterns, active travel around some of the interchanges. And typically, again, we would say that people would walk 15 to 20 minutes to get access to either a good bus route, or primarily the stuff I was doing was around the Tube and Crossrail.
Okay. Thank you. I'm aware it's 24 minutes past 10, and there are a lot of questions in here, so I'm going to try and cluster a few again, if that's all right. And I'd like to now start putting questions to all of the panelists, if that's possible. I hope this works. Of course, I embrace technology in all of its forms. Jonathan Hampson, I think, articulated it fairly nicely. It's a question, I think, I would interpret the question about sort of investment and subsidy in, whichever guise we want to look at it as. If we're considering new schemes that involve bus type objects in rural areas, there's been talk of investment, there's been talk of the need for funding. Jonathan's question, oh God, I've lost it now. No, I'm just going to ask the panelists on their view generally on kind of where the money is going to come from for this, whether it's fare box, subsidy or private investment, and what the implications of that might be on the health and longevity and fairness of those services. Sam, can I start with you, just as you were on first?
Sure. For me, it'll be a combination of all three of those. But the fundamental point, I think there's two fundamental points. Someone obviously needs to take the lead. I think that often it's the public, it's public funding that takes the lead, but then often there isn't a clear path to how we reduce the reliance on that public funding, which is often where things fall down. And I think that giving the private sector an easy and kind of easy to track way of sort of contributing towards that subsidy is one way of reducing the reliance on the public subsidy. So, if staff, if an employer wants to get a certain amount of staff to use a service, or a university has a certain number of students using a service, then being able to pay fairly for those specific individuals, I think, is one way of doing it. But we have to provide a platform that makes that easy and kind of brings together fare box income, public subsidy, and private income together. But someone does need to lead, for sure.
Yeah. Graham, maybe do you have a perspective from your Oxfordshire work?
Sure. I think subsidy, particularly for rural bus routes, is a complex issue, and with austerity, the county council chose to remove the rural bus subsidy several years ago. And reintroducing subsidies, I think, is a political question. Well, I think what's unambiguous is how can we do with more with less, particularly in rural communities, and that no matter what that subsidy question, the answer to that question is doing more with less will improve services throughout.
And do we think that, Nick, I will come to you on this one. It's just the others were talking so specifically about bus stuff, and I don't want to lose this. The subsidy investment part, a question cropped up, it might even be Jonathan again. Investment in rural buses, should we be asking the question more effectively about investing in rural communities, of which access and transport is one, and therefore just one component, and therefore are we asking the right question, and are the priorities being pointed in the right direction? Any comments on what we're investing in here and how we capture the benefit of that investment? Oh, silence. Oh no. We may come back to it. I'm going to throw another question at you, Sam, just at the moment, if I can find it. Well, no, it came up in relation to your presentation, but I think it's a more general one. There is always the problem, certainly in rural areas, of cherry picking the profitable corridors. Do we have any comments or thoughts on whether we can use these more innovative approaches to ensure that we're not creating new transport deserts, even though we're using innovative schemes in rural areas? So maybe to Sam first, and then to either of the other two panelists. I'm not picking on you, Sam, it's just you were first on. So,
yeah, thanks, Alistair. Yeah, I guess my answer to that would be that I think the job of new mobility solutions in rural and suburban areas is to, by nature, target those that are currently public transport deserts and currently have high levels of private car usage or transport deprivation, and therefore people can't access the workplace or education and so on, and therefore by nature we're targeting some of those areas. I think, of course, it's going to be we will never serve everybody perfectly, but we can get close to doing so by introducing a range of options. And obviously what Nick was talking about, I'm sure if you dived into some of those segments more specifically, there'd be some people that were more likely to cycle than others, some people that were more likely to take the bus than others. And therefore, I don't think, as long as we are introducing a range of solutions and making them more specific to specific groups who have very different needs, then I think we can minimize the risk of creating new public transport deserts.
Okay. Graham or Nick, do you want to come back into the kind of inadvertent creation of new transport deserts question?
Yes, I mean, to pick up with what Sam was saying, you see, I think the desert starts in these very small rural areas, where you've got hamlets, and it starts there, but also it then works its way into the towns, because It's one thing to take away the bus services, but with an aging population, they depend upon these bus services to get into those communities. So it's not just about tourism around here. It's actually about people going in to do their weekly shopping and to connect as part of the wider community. And of course, if they can't get in and there's no other means of doing that, then those communities themselves die. Now that actually goes into the pocket of the local authority. You know, the local authority will suffer through that model because eventually business rates will be at the point where businesses are closing, therefore they don't get the rate revenue. But I think it gets us back to this point about the balancing of the use case. Really going back to the last point, I don't think it's, you know, as we've found with health, okay, 20, 30 people a week using a service to go to the doctor's surgery, and it was costing them 5K, I think, a year to provide this service. And then they said, well, it's, you know, it's just not being used enough, so we'll stop it altogether. But of course, within the next 12 months, you've got a doctor spending a quarter of his time on the road, on call, servicing that exact group of people. Well, I don't know what we're paying GPs now, but I suspect that's around 20K a year. And suddenly 20K a year changes the whole dynamic again, that you'd actually go and put that back into an DRT system. So I think there's a business case here which isn't being properly understood, but I do think it needs to be led by the authorities themselves, because that's where the main costs sit.
Okay, I am aware we're now technically over time. We've kind of, there's been a little chatter among the organisers. I think we're going to continue till about 1:45, but we accept that some people might need to drop off and do a runner. So if you need to do that, well, feel free to do so, and thank you for taking part. I will bring it round at the end to the main core idea of this seminar, which is about sort of the green restart, rather than just getting into the detail of these enduring rural transport questions. There's a couple of questions I'd like to just pick up first. And a few have come up about relating to cycling and bikes on buses. I'd like to broaden that question though to, you know, kind of perhaps a more rural specific problem of mixing modes in order to make whole journeys. So getting from a relative, well, mixing mode to make whole journeys. So whether that's getting on a bike to get to a bus to get to somewhere else, or whether it might be using some sort of rideshare scheme to get to a transport hub, or whether it, you know, whatever it might be. And so can I just throw that as an issue to all the speakers? To what extent does your experience or your services allow for and promote and enable the complexities, almost the required complexities of real journeys in rural areas? And can it help accommodate that? I'll phrase it like that. Could I go to Graham first, simply because I keep picking on the other two?
Sure. Anecdotally, from the Cities for People project, we found that people in rural communities were happy to make multimodal journeys, and that was not as transfers were not considered as much of a barrier as they were for more urban users of our services. That said, I think what we're talking about here is a mass solution of how can DRT act as a true feeder service for traditional bus routes, also incorporating active travel into that first mile or even quarter mile to reach a DRT as something to be explored. How much of an influence will a mass platform have on allowing people to access existing public transport routes by providing a first and last mile offering through active travel and DRT? I think that's an interesting question.
Sam, Nick, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, what we see is that, you know, a number of our services, you know, a number of our passengers connect via active travel to one of our pickup locations. Some of our pickup locations are even park and ride locations. So we do see some of that kind of first last mile activity happening without actually directly necessarily integrating it. I do think, though, it's something that we talk a lot about. We talk about mobility as a service. We talk about kind of multimodality a lot, and actually it's very complex. And you're asking sort of, you know, two very different models to come together and create the perfect experience. And I think there's sort of two challenges with that, one of which Nick talked on earlier, which is, you know, there might be a number of people that actually cycling a distance to a pickup location, it just isn't suitable or not possible for them. And the second one is that once you introduce friction in a journey, if the alternative for that person is to drive a car, and we're talking about decarbonisation here, then it's likely that person will just go back to their car and drive direct, because, you know, that multimodality does inevitably introduce some friction. And despite lots of us talking about the, you know, how we can make have a multimodal future and integrate all of this perfectly, we're a long way away from having that that integrated network.
Okay.
Can I just add to that? There's quite a few studies out there which show that the point that Sam said about the friction, that actually people really don't like modal shift. And we did some studies when I was in London that showed that people would quite happily almost double the length of the journey just to remain either, you know, on a bus or remain on the tube. And certainly living where we are, actually we have, when we go in the car to go to the station, which is 2 miles away, you then actually often think, well, I'm in the car, I will carry on with my journey into Sheffield. And so I think you can underestimate this modal stickiness, really. And actually, I think the buses need to reflect that kind of doorstep to destination that people like about their private vehicles.
Okay, thank you for that. Oh heck, we really are getting late now. I've just noticed that Patrizia Franco, I wanted to squeeze in here somewhere the assets project that's taking place at the moment, about which I know very little at the moment, but it might just be worth flagging it up a little bit, which I think what a lot of the speakers have been talking today about is being able to understand more clearly and capture and hopefully operationalize demand in rural areas, and therefore start supplying services that more closely match those demands. Now, I may have got this wrong, but I understand that the assets project is starting to look at that in a bit more detail, in terms of how we can understand that a little bit better. Now, I have stacks of questions here, which are just going to have to become Christmas decorations, because what I'd like to do is get back to the kind of part of the title we haven't really touched on very much, which is about a green restart. So, you know, we hear about Green New Deals, we hear about Build Back Better, we hear about all of these things. I'd just like to therefore throw a question out to the panelists on, regardless of the detail of what we've heard about today, whether that be the gremlins or the exciting opportunity, from a broad green perspective, and by that I mean sort of, you know, fair environmental benefit, where do you see the recovery from coronavirus providing the key opportunities to help embed fairness in access and environmental impact reduction through transport in rural areas? So nothing too big, but would anyone like a first crack at that one?
I don't mind having a go, Alistair. So, yeah, I think that we should view this as an opportunity. But it's going to take some very forward-thinking local authorities, policymakers, and adaptable operators to make it happen. I think the active mobility announcements that have been made are fantastic, but they can't serve everybody. cycling, and walking isn't possible for many journeys, and is also a very different concept on a sunny spring morning versus a wet, windy morning. And therefore, I think that from our perspective, in the kind of mass transit public transport space, I think that this is an opportunity for policymakers to embrace new models. And I think the danger is if we rely on the same existing public transport operators with the same existing commercial arrangements and regulation, I'm not quite sure we'll get there. So I think that that there is definitely an opportunity here, but to avoid that surge in private car use, which we're sort of actively being told to do at the moment to some degree, we've got to adapt the public transport network very quickly.
Nick, Graham, do you have any thoughts on this generally? What are the barriers, I suppose, to both getting better, fairer, more comprehensive access services in rural areas, coupled with the necessity for environmental improvement?
I think
Sam's point was very good. I mean, the challenge we've got at the moment is obviously shared use is going to be a bit of a taboo, and it's going to be about personal use for the immediate future. I think the good thing is the emphasis on cycling and walking. Definitely more can be done with that in rural areas. But I think we've got to plan for the future. We've got to recognise that this has happened. We will get over it without doubt. This will be put behind us within 5, 6, 7 months, who knows. But whatever we then do as a programme going forward, I think DRT and the use of buses has to be the single biggest opportunity to improve rural transport and get us out of cars. So I'd like to think actually sustainability is going to be the key, and we'll get people out of cars because they won't want hydrocarbon based vehicles in the future, and they'll think electric vehicles are too costly. So they'd rather go for a shared use, lower cost operating model.
Okay, and Graham, do you have any thoughts on this? You're allowed to say no, or it's too complicated, but any thoughts while we're on it?
Yeah, I agree with Nick and Sam's comments. One thing to add is that a DRT service would make contact tracing dramatically easier than a traditional bus route, which I think increases the appeal of that sort of an offering.
Great, thank you. Now then, we really are up against time now, so I'm going to draw it to a close. I am going to ask the panelists within 20 seconds each what your headline that needs to be done is in order to get to where we need to be. Sam, you up first. I'm picking on you.
Thank you again. Adapt policy. I think we need to invest in public transport and break down the barriers between public and private provision of these services if we're really going to make progress as quickly as we need to.
Thank you. Nick?
I think we have to better understand the uses of transport in rural areas. It's a bit of a black hole, and I think demand patterns have to be properly understood, and you have to do it on an individual basis. You can't just use blanket modelling. You need to actually get down to the agent level and understand the specifics about people's trips, trip numbers, and the purpose of those trips, if you're going to have any chance of putting in a system which is going to work long term.
Great, thank you. And Graham, just to finish off.
Sure. Co-creating in-depth mobility solutions with the community not only better understands demand and creates better suited solutions, but also builds a partner in the community to deliver those solutions.
Great, wonderful. Thank you very much, everybody. Right, we're 15 minutes over, so I will go and stand outside and be thrashed by twigs or whatever is my punishment now. Thank you to our speakers. As usual, it takes a lot of effort to put thoughts together for these things and keep on the ball during during presentations. So thank you very much for that. There's some really interesting stuff in there. And by looking at the questions, there is clearly, it has triggered all sorts of thoughts and questions. So that is a good sign. So thank you to the participants who've contributed questions as well. As I say, the presentations, the whole seminar has been recorded, and that will be available to all participants afterwards. So if you've missed something, then you can go back to it. There are lots of questions that I think have been put up there that are directed at individual speakers, so I would invite those people to make contact afterwards as well for any more detailed responses to that. And hopefully the questions will help with the whatever the speakers are doing anyway. So this is a good opportunity for that. I think I shall leave it there. Thank you to everyone. Thanks for the Landor crowd for organising this. May there be many more, and this becomes a constructive way of getting stuff happening as well. Thanks once again to Zeelo for sponsoring it, for putting the money up to make it happen. It's very much appreciated. Okay, I think we're there. I hope the rest of you have a wonderful sunny day. Okay.
Thanks, Alistair.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Alistair.
Alistair.